Hello, so this is our last iteration, iteration 8. This iteration is optional. So I repeat again, this is optional. And the purpose of this iteration, the general idea is to use the color to paint. So back to our iteration plan. We completed our 7 iteration out of 8, and we're now on the very last one using the color to paint in the new screen or on the new screen. Problem formulation, again, back to the app development process, being very disciplined here. Scope, we want to draw on the second view using the color we selected with the first view. This part is optional, or if you're watching the video as part of the class, this is an extra credit if you would like to do it. To test, select a color, go to the second screen and paint and use the color to touch and start painting. So how are we going to do that? Now this is a bit more involved. So we start again, model view controller. So in the model, to paint on the screen, there are different ways that you can paint on the screen. The one I'm going to introduce you to is basically says that the paint is nothing but a group of points that constitute a path, and these points are connected to one another with a line. So the same model as before for the view, but then for painting, you need a brush, which in our case will be our finger, and this brush need a thickness, a color, so we'll use the color that we created to be the color, and we'll just assume a thickness, and then use the touch of the finger to represent the brush. Then you need the what you draw on. So we're gonna be drawing on the screen, but the screen has a view. So are we drawing on the view? You can, or you can draw on a special type of view called image view. I'm gonna go with the UI image view, which is a subversion of a view, like another user interface components that is a view, because it will make it easy for me to save that image when I am done. So now think about when you try to paint, you have a brush and you have um, the canvas. Then how do you go about painting? You touch the canvas and then you drag your brush over the canvas, and that gives you the line because the color from the brush that paints on the canvas and you see what you wanted to paint. In the digital world, when we touch the screen or touch on the image view, we are selecting a point. And as we drag over the screen, that point changes. So if I keep track of the points of the touch, the location of the touch on the screen, I can construct a path that I can then connect the dots of that path or the points of that path and come up with the painting that I wanted to paint. So there is a library called UI Bezier Path. The Bezier Path is a library object or a library type that is able to collect different points and then construct a painting out of those points, either by filling the shape that these points make or stroking a line to connect those points, or an arc, or both, or things like that. We will need something that we have everything we need for the color, and now we have a component for the canvas, we have a component to collect the points. We need something that represents the brush size, and here we're going to use a float type to represent the brush size. So on the view, there's no changes to the view. Very interesting. You'll see how involved this work is, but it's all done behind the scene in the controller. Nothing in the view will be changed or added. So in the controller, there's work that needs to be done on both controllers. The first controller will reconstruct the color, where we need to construct the color and move the color, which is what we already have. But we're gonna need to create the canvas in the first controller and transfer the canvas to the second controller. The reason we want to do that is so that the first controller takes ownership of the canvas. When the first controller takes ownership of the canvas, I'm then going to allow, or it will allow the user to go back and forth between the two screens without losing the drawing that they made. If I keep the canvas on the second controller, once the user hit the back button, everything in the second controller disappears. Because every time you go from the first controller to the second, you are launching a new instance of the second controller. So the segue does not maintain automatically does not persist the first does not persist the second controller between different going back and forth. Every time you go to the second controller, a new second controller is created. Think about the second controller as a box. Every time you go from the first to the second, you're going to a separate box. So I have to, when I go to the first box and do something, I have to save it in my first controller. So when I go to the second, I take it with me. And that's why I'm defining the canvas object in the class scope of the first controller and copying it through the segue to the second controller. In the second controller, that's all the fun will be, all the work will be. What do we want to do in the second controller? We want to paint, sure, but what does painting mean? Painting meaning that I want to recognize, I want to provide the user with a canvas. So I want to create a canvas or take the canvas reference from the first controller and put it on all the screens. So it has to have the size of the entire screen. Then I want to recognize when the user touches the canvas. Once the user touches the canvas, I want to get that location, and that becomes the beginning of the drawing. Then if the user lifted their finger, then that ends the drawing. But if the user dragged the finger, what you do when you draw, you touch the canvas and then you drag. Then when you drag or when you move your finger over the canvas, I want to capture all of these locations, add them to the first location, and make a path. Then draw that path in digitally and assign it to the image. And we'll see how we're going to do that. So in the solution implementation, I'm going to be going back and forth between the two. First, in the second controller, create a canvas object like I did with the color and add it to the view. And then go back to the first controller, create a canvas object, which is an instance of UI image view, set its size, and then in the prepare for segue, assign the canvas to the canvas property in the second view. This is very similar to what we did in the previous iteration with the color. Now in the second controller, I will need to capture the event when the touch begins and when the touch moves. When the touch begins, I need to start the path. When the touch moves, I need to follow the path and then strike the color or strike the connection between the points. So I will override a function called touch began, which is a function in the UI view controller or the UI view, and retrieve the location from the touch and add it as a starting point in the path object. And I forgot to say that I need to create a path object. Create an instance of UI Bezier path and a variable to represent the brush size. Then override the touch moved function, retrieve the location added to the path, and then we're gonna draw in memory. So when we draw in memory, we're going to define a context, and we're going to define an image context, draw the path in the image context, retrieve that image, all of this in memory, and the user is not going to see it, and then assign that image to the image view, and that's when the user will see it. You'll see how we're going to put all of this together to do the painting. And when we're done with that, this will conclude our iteration 8 and conclude our entire project. Before I leave you and we go implement this, I want you to feel free to add your own iterations and enhance the app. I want you to, if you're taking this for class, to give me an app that represents you. I'm not expecting you to change much from what I did, but for instance, you can change layout a little bit. You can, in this particular example, you can do a little bit difference. You can change the feel. You can change the user interface. You can enhance existing functionality. For instance, we allow the user to choose a color. Maybe we allow them to choose the size of the brush, or the brush size as well. Or you may think of other things you want to do as well. If you're a beginner, don't delve too much. Coming to the end here is an accomplishment. If you know a little bit of programming and you want to explore more, I invite you to do that. So if you have any questions, just let me know, and let's go ahead and implement this exciting iteration.